In this episode of the How to Do Your 20s podcast, we're going to be talking about how to run a marathon. And as always, we're going to be talking about some entrepreneurship. I have Trevor with me, who's created an entire business around one of his passions, which is running marathons. And that's always an exciting story for me. So first off, Trevor, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Travis, thanks for having me. People have called me Travis mistakenly through the years.
And I've gotten Trevor a lot through the years, so it happens.
It's not right, man. How are we going to stop that from happening in the future?
I don't know.
We have to
That's
we have to rise up, man.
I think if we just stand next to each other all the time, they'll always know. They'll get it right. It's like, hey, Trevor. I'm like, are you talking to him? Oh, no, never mind.
I also have another problem. My last name is Spencer, which is a good first name, so I get called that. Life is hard, man.
Hard life.
How did it get to be this hard? All right.
Well, let's get into your story then. How did it get to be so hard? No, I'm just kidding. But like, how did you get involved with marathons, doing a podcast on marathon running, all of that? What led into this?
Marathons. I guess I just like suffering and pain. Here's the story. My wife has always enjoyed running. We've been married going on 14 years. And when we were dating, I would go on runs with her, just wanting to hang out, spend time. But it was always miserable because I really hated running. I was athletic. I liked team sports, but running was not fun for me. So marathons, they were nowhere on the radar for me. We moved to Missouri in 2007, and my wife, Angie, decided to sign up for a marathon, which she trained for and successfully completed, but had some injury and some problems. So she really decided to dive to how to train better. She's also a nurse, so has health and fitness background too, medical background. But she started figuring out really the science and the nuts and bolts of how to train smart, and went on and did even better at her second marathon and third and fourth and fifth, and now she's done like 48 at the time of this podcast. But now something is happening simultaneously. I'm also kind of getting more dissatisfied at the job that I was at, and I started thinking about, well, how could we kind of live life more on our terms, design a business that would enable us to live anywhere, because I'm not originally from Missouri, and I kind of miss the mountains. So let's think about what's our exit strategy. So around that same time, I figured out that you can make money on the internet. It's really strange how that came about. We can get in that later. But podcasting came on my radar. So I pitched the idea to my wife. Let's do a podcast on marathon training. She said, "What's a podcast?" This is 2010. I was 29. Just had to throw that in because this is the How to Do Your 20s, right?
Yep.
So I squeaked in, man. I was 29. So podcasting was still kind of an early thing. It was in, I think, the second wave of podcasts. Right now we're in the third wave, they say. But I was able to eventually convince her to do a podcast on marathon training. And the deal was that I had to start running more consistently. So the thesis that I had in my head was, can I learn to love something that I hate? Can I learn to love running? Because I don't know, maybe hate's a strong word. I just kind of tolerated it. And the thesis proved to be true. You can indeed, change your personality in such a way that you learn to like what you first didn't like. And now I've done 12 marathons, and I'm hopefully going to do about 2 this year. I try to do about 2 a year. I'm not as gung-ho as my wife is. But yeah, I mean, I definitely love the trails. I love the freedom of being able to just go and run 10 miles or 20 miles. I love the feeling of accomplishment, the mental toughness that it builds. A lot of great things. Tons of benefits to long distance running. So the show is called Marathon Training Academy, and we've been podcasting now for 7 years.
That is awesome. So I have to ask, how did you go from just tolerating running marathons or running in general to actually enjoying it? That seems like a big accomplishment.
I know. For somebody who's just starting out, we would recommend doing like a run walk method. So the way I started was let me think about this. Ran for a minute, walked for 3. Ran for a minute, walked for 3 until I built up my endurance to running for 3 minutes and then running for a whole mile and then building up to 3 miles. The first time I did an actual race, it was a 12K race in Washington State. And I was really nervous, but it was exciting and fun. I was like, oh yeah, I can see why people get into this. So doing races, also just meeting runners and hanging out with runners and watching those miles build as you get better and better at it. It really has a way of growing on you, I guess. And then after I ran my first half marathon, because I did a half before I did a full, which is advisable. I felt like, man, I just accomplished something big. And then when I ran my first marathon in 2011, I ran the St. Louis Rock and Roll Marathon. I finished in 4:31. So, I'm solid middle of the pack runner. I'm not like a speedster, but that accomplishment will always stay with me. Running your first marathon is life changing, and that's kind of our tagline too of our show is empowering people to run a marathon and change their life. I mean, there's been so many benefits that running a marathon has brought in the form of like confidence and just being able to do other things easier too. I mean, I've hiked in the Andes since running a marathon, and it's just there's just no problem doing some of the stuff that maybe other people would find hard. If you've run a marathon, it kind of reframes what's hard,
So you talked a little bit about the training leading up to the marathon. Let's say your average listener here can run for 30 minutes. Like they don't need to do the run walk. Would you still advise starting with the run walk, or is that not as important?
If the average listener can already run 30 minutes without stopping, no, then they're on their way to building up a good running base. If the goal is to run a marathon, they need to have a solid base before they even start training. Most marathon training plans are about 20 weeks long, beginner plans anyway. But before you even start that, you need to have a base of running about 3 times a week, 3 miles at the least, and doing that for 6 months consistently. So 6 months, 3 miles at least, 3 times a week, and then you have a solid base to officially begin marathon training, which is about 20 weeks. And that'll build you up to about 20 miles, and then you'll be ready to go for the marathon. At least the training plans that we have on our website, they go up to 20 miles,
And
even though the marathon is 26.2.
Okay. Actually, now I'm curious. Why does it only go up to 20 miles? Is it you have just so much? You're so excited that those 6 miles will be easy, or?
Yeah, if you can do 20, you can do 26, and there's lots of training plans that have you go more than 20, but our philosophy is kind of less is more sometimes. We really emphasize injury prevention. I think because my wife was a nurse prior to becoming a running coach, she's designed our plans in such a way that we really want to help people not overtrain, because overtraining is the number one cause of injury. So basically, the gains that you would make running more than 20 miles in your training at a time would not be worth the risk of injury for those extra 6 or however many. So 20 is kind of that sweet spot that we found that, if you can bang out a couple 20 milers in your marathon training, you're going to be able to go the full distance.
So obviously, if people want the full plan, they can contact you guys, get some coaching. But can you give us the broad strokes of what that 20-week plan looks like?
Okay, so there's always some easy runs. If a person's a total beginner, we have a beginner marathon training plan that involves 3 days of running per week, which is another philosophical difference perhaps between what we offer and maybe some other plans you find online, is because of our less is more philosophy and wanting to minimize running injuries. We only have people run about 3 days a week if they're beginners, and then we do balanced cross-training interspersed between running days. Running back-to-back days is not advisable. Running hard every single every single time you have a run scheduled. That's not advisable either. So there'll be an easy day, and then there'll be like a more of a tempo run day, and then there'll be a long run day. So like an easy and a tempo and a long run. And that is pretty much how each week looks, with cross training in between and rest. And then the plan just kind of gradually steps the person up on their long runs. First long run might be, haven't looked at the plan recently, but first long run might be, 7 miles, and then it'll go up to 8 and then 9, and then it'll be step back weeks where you'll kind of go back down to 7. And that's all for, injury, minimizing risk of injury and maximizing your body's recovery. So that kind of tapers and steps up and steps down until the person gets up to their 20 miler. The first 20 miler is always a big deal. We have lots of folks who train with us and report back on their first 20 miler. It's a huge accomplishment. It does seem daunting, to wrap your head around. In fact, just the other day, I was driving home and I drove past the mile marker on the highway where I started my 20 miler one time, and I'm like, this is a long way to run. I was just thinking about when I ran home from this little town, and it still is to me, and I've done 12 marathons now, it still seems like a huge distance, 20 miles. But when you get that 20 miler done, it feels so good, and it's hard not to brag to friends and coworkers. What'd you do today? Not much. Ran 20 miles.
Yeah.
How about you?
Watch some TV, nothing big.
Yeah.
So what, other than obviously overtraining, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see first-time marathoner runners making during training?
All right. Here are some mistakes. Not getting good running shoes. Now, what I mean by good is it's wise if you go to a specialty running store where they have a treadmill, and they'll put you on that thing, and then they will evaluate your gait, how you land, your foot strike, if you pronate, if you are a heel striker, if you're a toe striker. They'll be able to evaluate you and put you in the right running shoe, which will help with, I don't know, man. When I've had the wrong shoes, I've gotten shin splints, I've gotten runner's knee issues crop up. I mean, nothing serious and debilitating, but those things are really annoying to deal with. So getting the right running shoes can prevent that. A lot of people will just grab shoes that they've had for years, and they look good, so they look like they're still new, so I'm going to go use those. But you should only put about 400 miles on a pair of shoes, because then they've pretty much been broken down to the point where you're probably going to start having issues crop up, injuries and stuff, if you keep going. So keep a log of how many miles you're putting on your running shoes. Make sure you get a pair from a specialty running store that is going to help you land better when your foot falls and hits the ground. Okay, so that's a big mistake. And then what else? A lot of times when people are first starting out, they think they have to go out and run hard every single run. Like, they're not making gains unless they're pushing hard. Every run has to be tempo. And that's a quick way to burn yourself out. So that really falls into the category of overtraining. But a lot of times, just giving, if we give permission to people just to be easy on themselves, like, go out and just go slow, it's fine. People sometimes appreciate that. They're like, wow, thank you, because I feel like I'm just being lazy unless I go out and push really hard. So that's a mistake, thinking they have to run super fast every time. Another mistake would be skipping cross training. In fact, we just talked about this on a recent podcast. And I'm kind of a lazy runner. So I skipped a lot of cross training days when I was training for my first marathon. And my legs were killing me by the time that marathon was over. It was hard to even walk back to the hotel. Whereas if I would have done more, core strengthening and strength training and cross training, I would have been in better shape for it. So it's important to cycle or hit the pool or do some weights and some yoga and some core training and whatever your thing is. It's there's lots of options when you're training for a marathon, but to get that cross training in, because running works out certain muscles. Don't ask me what they are, because I can't geek out on that, but Cross training is going to balance those other muscles that are being kind of ignored when you're running. So that's why cross training is important. So I think people ignore that to their own detriment, and that's another mistake.
What about diet during training? And how does that, let's go diet during training and then leading up to like the day before and the day of the race. What kind of diet do you recommend?
Yeah, that's a good question. So another mistake is that when you're doing these hard workouts and these long runs, you think, well, man, how many calories did I burn today? That's amazing. I can just maybe now be more slack on what I eat and more relaxed. So you can actually eat a lot more junk food and just junk stuff when you're training for a marathon, because you figure, well, it's all going to work out, and you're hungry all the time. You get back from a run, you're like ravenously hungry, so you can eat a lot more calories. So it's important to just to eat clean. There's not a particular diet that's one size fits all. I mean, my wife and I tend to be more on the paleo spectrum, and I try not to eat a lot of grains and processed foods and sugars. Some people do really well on that stuff. I mean, some people can eat sugar like Willy Wonka and still manage to do fine. As far as when the race day approaches, the whole notion of carbo loading before a race has kind of been debunked in recent years. We've had Professor Tim Noakes on our podcast twice, and he's authored the book The Lore of Running, and probably the most eminent running scientist in the world. And he's a South African man, and he really pushed the carbo loading model in the 70s, and now he's completely reversed, and he's on the kind of the high fat, low carb bandwagon now. But he says, the science has come around to show that carbo loading is really not necessary, the night before a marathon. So the pasta dinner might be fun to go to, but it's not necessary to have a successful marathon. In fact, my wife and I, before we do a race, we'll just go and eat whatever. We just try not to eat very, very late, because we want everything to settle down. We want to get a good night's sleep. And then the next day before we start our marathon, we eat absolutely nothing. We just go out and run on an empty stomach. And that's a philosophy we got from Hammer Nutrition, and it's worth checking out. But basically, I can just drink coffee because I'm a coffee drinker, and then go out and I have a product I use called Generation UCAN, which is a super starch kind of slow release carbohydrate source that I've been using for a few years now, and it works really well, and I've turned a lot of people onto it as well. But as far as solid food, real food before a marathon, I don't take any of it, because here's the thing: if you're going to eat before a marathon, you've got to have time to let the food digest, because running and digestion do not mix. Running is hard on your digestion. Just test that. Anyone listening to this, you want to test that out. Eat a big breakfast and then go out on a run, see how you do. Don't even eat a big one. Just eat a small breakfast. You'll probably get GI distress. There's something called runner's trots. Here's what everybody needs to do right now. Stop what you're doing and Google runner's trots, and go to Google Images and just see what comes up.
Doesn't sound like a good idea. I can't see that going well, but
it's not a pretty sight.
I can imagine.
Viewer discretion is advised. So, is this making any sense? I feel like I'm just sort of...
No, this is making perfect sense. So what was the name of the author again that you've had on twice?
His name is Dr. Tim Noakes.
Tim Noakes. So
Noakes,
does
yeah.
Tim Noakes recommend a ketogenic style diet, like that extreme, or just more of a little bit less than that?
I don't think it's ketogenic. His newest book, I think it's like Real Food Revolution. It's a cookbook, and when we had him on the podcast last, he was just about to launch that book in the States, and I haven't got a copy of it yet, but that'd be worth looking into. But no, I just think it's like kind of lower carb, but not, not putting yourself into ketosis.
And I'm just curious for personal reasons. Now, I don't know if a ketogenic would even make sense for marathon running because I think you would need some of those carbs. But as we talked about the idea I have for my new business, are there people that actually run marathons in ketosis, or is that pretty much a bad idea?
I don't know of any personally who have done that. I have certainly not done it, but I've heard of it being done.
Mm.
I think Ben Greenfield has done a triathlon in ketosis. Do you know who Ben Greenfield is?
Yep. Yeah.
If my memory serves me correctly, I think he did that, but I do not know for sure. But that's a good question. So I can't help you out on that, man.
No problem. So let's get back into the more entrepreneurship side of this. And I think earlier in the podcast, you said you have an interesting story, how you've kind of found out about internet marketing and all that kind of stuff. Let's dive into that.
All right. So here's the story. So I was in ministry, and there's not a lot of money to be made in some corners of ministry. And everything was kind of startup. I started a church, and I'd worked in a nonprofit school for at-risk teenagers. And it was nonprofit with the emphasis on the non, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking to myself, well, I have a family now, some kids, and I need to create an income source. So I read the book Rich Dad Poor Dad, Robert Kiyosaki, and what do they talk about in that? Real estate, mm-hmm. right? So I kind of started looking on the internet about real estate investing, and fix and flips were big back then. This is before the housing market crash. And I didn't end up getting into any of that, mainly because of my aversion to debt. I kind of had a philosophy of I don't want to go into debt. So not going to go borrow a bunch of money to buy a house right now. But the book, Rich Dad Poor Dad, is more than just real estate. It sort of gives you a paradigm shift, right? About working on your own terms and being a business owner instead of being an employee. So that was very helpful. And in my search on the internet into how to make money in real estate, I sort of stumbled upon how to make money online. And it dawned on me that people were actually making money on the internet. This is probably in 2007. So I knew absolutely nothing about how to do it or how people were doing it. So I literally went to Wikipedia sometimes and just looked through articles, about these terms that I was seeing, like what is click-through rate, and what is a landing page. And I was printing out Wikipedia articles, which was not what I needed to do, because there's a sea of information that you can just drown in when it comes to finding out how to do this. I actually started with trying to do an e-commerce store. I know you're an e-commerce guy, but it was a product that it looked like it had good search results and potentially could be profitable, but I just had no passion for it. So I invested a little bit in a program to learn how to do e-commerce, but I sort of fizzled out on it because I didn't really feel the enthusiasm to keep going. And it was around that time I found some podcasts that talked about how to set up an authority site, the publishing sort of model of doing business online. So that's why we started our podcast to really put our voice out there in the world, which is something that I was used to doing through ministry anyway, because I'm kind of a teacher at heart. So it more fit my personality. And that's the important thing is there's lots of ways to make money online, but what fits your personality? Some people could kick butt when it comes to e-commerce, and others, writing and publishing ebooks, and other people can, rock it with podcast and, branding themselves. It just depends on what a person's personality is. So that's how I got into it, and it took quite a while. It was quite a learning curve to get around because I wasn't a technical person. I didn't even own a laptop when I started looking into this stuff, and I don't even think I had internet at my house.
So
that was
talk us through. So All right, so one day you decide you want to start a podcast, and obviously, I mean, I think we can skip past some of the technical things because that's for a whole nother show. But how did you start to get people to actually listen? How did you get guests? How did that ball start rolling?
Well, we did one thing right in the beginning, and that was picking a niche that wasn't too competitive. When I looked on iTunes for the search term marathon training, there wasn't any podcast specifically about marathon training. There was a podcast about two dudes that run marathons, but it was more like kind of an entertainment style podcast. So it wasn't at all what we planned on doing. We planned on going in and being more of sort of giving prescriptive, value and content and advice to people wanting to run their first marathon. It's going to be more of a how to do it sort of show. So picking a niche in which you could go in there and not have too much competition is smart. And also calling your show the right, naming your show correctly. So our show is called Marathon Training Academy. It's like no doubt what we talk about.
Right.
I think it would have been a little harder to attract listeners or even be found if it was named, something like the Angie and Trevor Show. Well, what's that about? You ever drive by a business and maybe it's a massive, store at the mall and it just has a name. You're like, well, what is it? What is that? What do they even sell there? I have no idea. Like, let's say put shoes underneath.
Mm.
They're not broadcasting to me what they're about and why I should go in there. I think that naming your podcast, as simple as it sounds, will set you up better for success in podcasting so people can find you. So from the very beginning, when we launched our podcast, it started getting found by folks and we started building an audience, and it was pretty organic. I didn't really have to, we didn't do any marketing. We didn't spend any ad dollars to get our show out there. We just started putting episodes out, and we started getting about 1,000 downloads a day from the beginning.
Wow. Okay. Was there ever a moment where you saw a big uptick, or was it just completely just a steady growth?
I would say there's no like hockey stick effect with our show, but it's been steady. We started out, we were getting about 1,000 downloads a day, and now it's more than that. We might get like 100,000 in a month. We do 3 shows a month, so it's more than 1,000 a day. But people also, they'll find our podcast and they'll go back and they'll listen to the past episodes.
Right.
So it's evergreen. And from what I've talked to Todd Cochran at Blueberries. Blueberries is one of the big podcast stats companies. And he says, if you have an evergreen podcast where your old episodes are also being downloaded, he says that's kind of rare. So a lot of podcasts are just getting that the newest episode is all people are paying attention to.
Mm.
Now, I don't know if you've shared podcast numbers on the show before, but maybe I'll just talk about what I've learned. I went to Podcast Movement, which is a huge, well, not huge, but it's the largest podcasting conference in the U.S. Have you been to Podcast Movement?
I went, I think 2 years ago, something like that.
Did you go to the Dallas? No, the what was it? Fort Worth?
Yeah, I went to that one.
Right.
Yeah.
I was there.
I might have saw you. That's funny.
I don't know.
Yeah.
You look kind of familiar. I don't know.
Yeah.
So when I was there, I was talking to Todd, and he said that the average podcast gets about 250 downloads per episode. That's the average podcast. And he also said that the most people at that conference were just getting into it too. They were pretty new at it.
Yeah.
But so if you've been doing it for a while, like we've been doing our show since 2007, it's hard to stay consistent for that long. Not 2007, sorry, it's 2010. I started looking into online business in 2007, started in 2010. So 7 years. But it's hard to stay consistent. That's one of the keys to success is, man, you just got to, people expect you to have a show out, and so you've got to deliver, and it's got to be, helpful, and and interesting and keep them engaged. But it's been a lot of fun. We've got to meet people who listen to our show, and we have a wonderful audience, and the feedback has been great. And if a person is thinking about starting a podcast, and let's say they don't get 1,000 downloads a day, maybe it's smaller than that, and there's nothing wrong with that. And you can definitely monetize and see a lot of traffic come to your business, even with a smaller podcast. If you had a room, this is what they said at the conference too, if you had a room with 200 people in it, that'd be a good size audience to speak to.
Absolutely.
So, an audience of 100 or 200, that's nothing to sneeze at all.
Absolutely. So one of my other questions for you, though, is at what point were you able to start? Actually, what were you doing? Were you still in ministry during this time when you were first starting the podcast? Or how did you make money, and then how did you switch it to being more full-time with the podcast?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was in ministry until just 2 years ago. In fact, we didn't launch out to do this full-time until the end of 2014.
What was the first point where you started making money from the podcast, and how did you do it?
It was surreal because when you're studying how to set up, an online business, and you're seeing all these people that are teaching it, of course they have like these huge numbers. We make $1 million a day doing this and that, and they have their mansions, and there's a lot of that stuff out there. So you're like, man, if I just had a fraction of this guy's success, I could at least afford to, quit my job and do this full time, and maybe do some traveling and other goals that I have. And it feels like so out there. Like, will I ever get to that point? Will I ever be able to do this full time? Like, are there people who just study this stuff for years and years, but it never actually works for them, and they never, they keep going to seminars and keep buying books, but it never comes together. And you have all these fears and all these thoughts. So it's very surreal when you actually make your first dollar online. And for us, it was this other internet marketer contacted me and said, hey, I'll pay you $200 if you guys put together a 1-hour training lesson for me that I could sell. And we're like, okay. So that was actually the first money that we ever made online was through that guy. And I don't even remember his name or what he did with the recording that we made for him. But I remember he said to me, he says, you guys are giving away way too much for free, because he looked at our podcasts and all the shows that we had done. We'd done like 20 by that time. He's like, you guys are giving away way too much for free, which is not good advice, because the more value you can give to people, for free, I think the better off you're going to be.
Oh, yeah, I absolutely agree with that. When you first said the giving away too much for free, I'm like, I don't know. Like, I think, I 100% believe give away as much value as possible. And it's like, all right, if people really want the nitty gritty kind of boring things, it's like, all right, yeah, you can pay for that. Like, I'll go over that, but give a lot of value for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it served us well. I mean, just giving value, and people are cool. People will reciprocate, and doesn't want to go deeper and go more into, the courses and the programs will. But and then some people won't at first, but maybe will, a couple years down the road, and they will, because you're there and you provide value, and eventually that value builds up, and that trust and the likability, and when people need you, they'll reach out.
Absolutely. So let's go forward a little bit more. So that was the first $200 you made there, and then what about after that? Like, was there other big moments in monetizing the podcast?
There wasn't any big moments or big paydays, big launches. There wasn't big anything. I mean, we just started small and just kept, growing steadily. But we eventually started a membership site, and my wife started doing one-on-one coaching. Then we started selling training plans and a few other things, an ebook. The podcast sponsorship came along a couple years later. Let me tell you how that came along, because that's been a nice thing in the last couple of years. So I wanted to start monetizing the podcast episodes more, not like junk it up with ads. Maybe do like 1 or 2 sponsors, short, like 1-minute blurps per episode. So there was this company that we believed in and recommended just in our own running, called Generation UCAN. They're a fueling company. And so our listeners started reaching out to this company and saying, hey, I heard about you on this podcast. And they were ordering stuff, and they were going to marathon expos and stopping by the Generation UCAN booth and saying, hey, I heard about you guys on the MTA podcast. And after enough of that, the folks at UCAN reached out to us, and they're like, hey, thanks for giving us props on your podcast. And he says, whenever someone comes to our booth and says they heard about us on a podcast, it's always your podcast. I'm like, well, that's awesome. So then I just reached out to those folks. I'm like, well, how about we put together some sponsorship spots? And they've been a wonderful sponsor since then. I've also got set up in Midroll. There's like a third-party ad agency called Midroll Media that sends some sponsors our way. And the other thing is with sponsorships, just reaching out to people. John Lee Dumas published a post a couple years ago called Podcast Sponsorship, Here's All the Goods. And he has some templates about, what to charge and how to reach out to folks. And it's all based on CPM, cost per melee or cost per 1,000 downloads. And so I kind of used that template to formulate how I wanted to do it. So it was a really helpful blog post that he wrote. But yeah, sometimes I've just reached out to folks, just kind of cold email, and have gotten sponsors. And sometimes people just reach out to me.
What are your plans for the podcast and the entire company in this new year?
Well, we're kind of in a transition right now because we're bringing on some other running coaches. So for years, my wife was the only running coach, and she had a waiting list because she had at her peak like 40 clients, which is a lot of one-on-one coaching because she's designing training plans and communicating via email with these folks, almost every day, some of them. So it was getting to be kind of overwhelming. So we thought, well, let's bring on some other coaches. So we've brought on 3 so far, and these are not full-time employees of ours or anything, but just basically working for us as freelancers. But these are running coaches with a lot of expertise, a lot of experience, and a similar philosophy. And they're really cool people too. In fact, all the coaches we've brought on have been more qualified than Angie. They're just not as well known. So at first it was like people only wanted to work with Angie because that's the only person that they knew and trusted. Even though these other coaches, like one of them has, a degree in exercise physiology from Columbia, and I mean they're just legit, highly experienced and trained folks. But since people didn't know them yet, there was some reluctance to say, all right, yeah, I'll be happy to work with another coach. So it was a process of introducing these new coaches to our audience and kind of pivoting the coaching program, and it's so far it's going well, and we've been really excited about the folks that we brought on and how we've been able to expand that way. I'm also for those that are just marketing geeks right now, just give me a minute here. I'm in the process of really redesigning my whole funnel architecture. It's something I've been working with a business consultant. I'm paying a lot of money right now to work with a business consultant who has looked at my systems and funnels and helping me really do things that I should have done in the beginning. So I'm signed up with some software now that will really help me market better to people based on their individual needs instead of just like marketing to everybody the same thing. So funnel architecture is what I'm working on. And I think that'll streamline a lot of our processes and be a big payoff for us. We're also going to hopefully this year do a virtual half marathon, something that we haven't done yet for our audience. So right now I'm getting a marathon medal designed because marathoners really like their bling. But But I'm getting a marathon medal that's just going to be the most ridiculous, over-the-top marathon medal that the world's ever seen. And then we're going to host this virtual half marathon so people can sign up for it. We'll mail the medal out to them. But they run the marathon, the half marathon on their own, wherever they're at. And then we'll have like a Facebook page or group where they can like post pictures, and we'll sort of make an event out of it. Maybe have some contests for, the most beautiful place a person's run, or the biggest group out running, or the fastest or slowest, or we'll just kind of really make it fun. And I don't imagine that I'll make, a lot of money from it, but it'll just be, I think, community building, which is important, right?
Absolutely. So I have one last question for you, and I ask this to all my guests. And this is, if you could go back and give your 20-something-year-old self advice, or more generally, just advice to all these 20-somethings listening right now about life, what would that advice be and why?
What would I tell my 20-something self? Here's what I usually tell. I really enjoy hanging out with guys that are in their 20s and gals. I worked with teenagers for years, but it was really like college age kids that's my sweet spot. But here's what I would tell them. And sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. Start putting away money for retirement now, right? What did Benjamin Franklin say? The money that money makes money. It's the power of compounded interest. One book I read when I was already in my late 20s was The Total Money Makeover by Dave Ramsey. And he talks about getting out of debt, saving up an emergency fund, getting on a written budget, and start saving 15% into mutual funds, like just growth stock mutual funds. And he says that a lot of times people don't save for retirement is because they're in debt, right? Or because they're not on a budget. And so there has to be sort of there's baby steps to get to the point where you're starting to save 15% a month. But we've been doing that since I read the book, and I was, probably 28 or 29 when I read it. But if I would have started in my early 20s, if you start saving even $300 a month in your early 20s, or even less than that, $200 a month, and then watch how that interest can compound, maybe multiply by a factor of, Dave Ramsey says 12%, but he kind of gets a lot of criticism for that. So I would say 8% to be safe, right? So figure 8% growth, $200 a month when you're in your early 20s, and watch how fast that money, watch how the pile of money you will have when you are 65 years old. So that's what I would have told myself. Start saving sooner. I call it that's my get rich slow plan. Because you got to have two plans. If you're a business owner and entrepreneur, it's possible to retire young, and I think to pile up some money quicker than just a regular employee would. So you can certainly get rich fast. A lot of people have. I'm not rich by any stretch, but I live a good life. But I'm not banking on that strategy. My get rich fast strategy is not my nest egg, right? So if that doesn't work, then my get rich slow is just doing the stock market thing. That's worked for millions of people. Just slow, steady investing over time, and that's my backup plan. So I have both those plans going. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. Awesome advice. Trevor, where can people find out more about you and everything you're doing?
Well, you can go to marathontrainingacademy.com if you're interested in learning about all things long distance running and training for a marathon, and would love to be of help to anyone who wants to do that. You can also find our podcast in iTunes. If you just put in marathon training, our podcast will come up. And we've been on the front page of the health category for a few months now, which is nice. So we're still there. We're up there with Jillian Michaels.
Wow, that's awesome.
Who I would love to have on our show. So if you have any connection with Jillian Michaels, let me know.
Absolutely. I do not, but if I find someone who does, I'll let you know. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. Hopefully, people will find something useful of all the rambling that went on here. But
hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. And if you did, make sure you hit the big red subscribe button down below. You can also check me out on Facebook and on Twitter. And I release a new video every Monday. And by hitting that subscribe button, you'll get those new videos every Monday. And this is really a podcast. It's also a website. You can check out the website. It's howtodoyour20s.com. I'll put a link right over here as well. And what it's all about is trying to improve your life. And we specifically focus on things that people in their 20s are interested in. So make sure you like the video if you liked it. Subscribe. Like us on Facebook and Twitter, whatever. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again on another video.